I think, in a lot of ways. But yeah, I did finally find, I was telling Andy, I didn't even know what the date was, but now I know why. I can't remember. It was 2020. So it's been
Oh,
5 years.
everything was happening. Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and it was in the middle of everything. And so I was like, but it also is good to help me review of like, okay, what are we not doing this that we should be doing that we say we're doing
Right.
as well? Because
Well, that's one of the questions I want to get to is how do you keep this a living document and not something that a church community just does once and puts on a shelf?
right. Yeah, and that's hard.
All right, we are, according to this, we are live streaming. So welcome if there are people watching.
Oh,
I'm going to hit record and then introduce us. So we're going to record. All right, let you all respond to that. Welcome, everybody. This is Andy Mangum. I'm the regional minister for the Christian Church in the Southwest, and we do these kinds of conversations periodically. I've got a new a colleague who's going to take over this because she's so much better at it than I am. Ginger Brandt is the senior associate minister at First Christian Church Tyler. She has a background in journalism, and so she's going to carry the conversation. Reverend Casey Tanguay is pastor of WestWind Christian Church in Keller, Texas, and is also a registered nurse, which I think is significant only because I think nurses are the greatest, as a class, the greatest people on the planet. So a friend and a good colleague, thankful for them. We're talking about congregationally based sexual misconduct policies. And so I'm gonna let you all take it over, and I'll mute myself and maybe step in and say a couple of things at the end.
thank you, Andy, for getting us started. So yes, as Andy said, I think I am a natural person to do these kinds of things because I just like to ask questions. And I'm so interested at when other churches are doing things well, I want to take notes. I think there might be a lot of notes today for churches of all sizes, Casey. And I guess I want to know, how do you as the pastor open the conversation to say to your lovely congregants, hey, we need to do something, and it's called a sexual misconduct policy?
Right. So hopefully, ideally, obviously, this comes up before it's too late, or because before it's a problem that you're responding to, that it's a more proactive conversation rather than a responsive or reactive
Okay.
conversation. Um, and several different ways it kind of naturally comes up over time are around when you're dealing with youth ministry and children's ministry transitions or new
Okay.
hires or new programs. It kind of naturally
Okay.
fits into that, as well as even if it's not a big transition, even just the yearly transitions that we hit every year with recruiting new
New
leaders,
volunteers. Okay. Okay.
volunteers, and figuring out like who is going to lead the youth and who's going to do Sunday school. That's a natural time for this to come up, at least initially, and maybe not even initially, but to revisit it as well. For us, we had a policy in place that we kind of we did follow, but weren't as attentive to it, right? Like we wrote it forever ago. It's gone out of sight, out of mind. And for us, it kind of naturally came up, or not even naturally, almost by force, when our insurance company was like, we need a copy of your policy
Mm-hmm.
to
A
have
lot
on
of churches have been
file.
in your boat, and I bet a
Right.
lot more of us are about to be there because of all the changes in church insurance. A lot of small congregations are being forced to find new carriers. Okay.
Right. And
So
so,
it was
and
a
that's kind of a mix between proactive, reactive, but that kind of forced the conversation of, okay, we've got to talk about this whether we want to or not.
okay.
But ideally, you're also having those conversations before even situations like that come up. And like I said, we had a policy in place, but it helped us then revisit it and update it and get it more up to par and more in insight and in mind
Yeah,
of how we're
totally to your credit. So I love the way, okay, you can use the insurance angle so that the pastor doesn't have to be the heavy, but also what your word to the wise there is don't let events act on you. You go out and act on events, and maybe what you do is say, this is an extension of our best practices. And every
right.
January we review best practices anyway, and every January we're talking about how do we get children and youth ministry done, and let's just extend the conversation maybe sounds like a natural way in.
Right. And so, so the easy, or I call it easy, that are natural, is approaching it for admin logistics. Like we need to do this for logistics and policy and liability and that sort of thing is kind of the
Okay.
entry point. But then ultimately, hopefully that's not the only reason, right? And hopefully that's not even sometimes the primary reason. Ultimately, that opens the conversation to, well, why are we doing this? And why is it important? Why do we even have, I mean, it's not a fun topic, right? Like we'd much
Exactly.
rather
Right.
just
Right.
ignore
And
it.
there's natural resistance, I think, because people get spooked about, do you think I'm doing it wrong? Do you think I'm gonna get in trouble? Am I suspected of anything? But I think you probably not knowing the whole story, I suspect you probably had some good positive conversations around WestWind about like the spirit of the thing and what we're trying to do and the culture we're trying to build. Because I just kind of read some of those words in your policy when I review it. What are some of
Right.
the things you said to lay people to kind of ease their fears or make them feel good about it?
Right. So there's always a conversation around that it is to ensure safe spaces, to as safe as we can, at
Okay.
least ensure safe spaces. And that's safe not just for whoever we're coming in contact with, our children, our youth, our congregants, but also safe for leaders as well and for volunteers, So there's that reciprocal um, idea of safe spaces and sacred spaces that kind of fit together of ensuring that we're caring for one another in the utmost most excellent way that we possibly can that covers both me and you. It's not just about me. It's not just about you. It's not just about outsiders. It's not just about insiders. It is about this whole beloved community. I mean, and how this fits into that idea of loving our neighbors as ourselves, and that respect and that unfortunately sexual misconduct plays a role in that, and that very easily ties into our theology, right?
Ah,
That comes up naturally. So there's the legalese, there's the business side of it, there's the logistics side of it, there's the liability side of it, but ultimately it does lead to a conversation of building community, and being in relationship with one another and why that is a priority for us as Christians.
yeah, I love that. Okay. So I heard this covers you and me, and that respect is part of being beloved community. So I guess you would have to get my thinking is you might have to get to that conversation early if you want a whole wide spectrum of people to participate and buy in. You might have to get to the theology of the thing because they're not moved by legalese or other requirements.
Right. And you might even have to approach it from more of that macro level, even initially,
Okay.
of before we get into the specifics of what the policy is going to be and what the language is going to be and what the process is going to be. How are we approaching it uniquely as
Okay.
Christians and as a church? And even under that, uniquely as like my church is very different from your church, right? So we also had to
Right.
take into consideration the uniqueness of our particular location, size, which in some ways doesn't matter, right? Like in some ways things are the same across the board, and there's definitions that we kind of get on the same
Mhm.
board from. But as far as how the policy is worded and implemented and talked about, context is going to make a difference, of how we talk about it and approach it.
Good words. Okay. So start at the macro and give people the reason why that ties into the theology of who we are. Be specific to your church. I see this. In my head, I'm reviewing how would this work in Tyler, Texas, and how could we also have a policy. We also don't talk about it a lot. And if I wanted to talk about it more, this is definitely the way in I would choose. Okay. Next interesting, fascinating thing about what WestWind did, you have written it into the policy, sort of an unavoidable, it acts on us event. Every year you have to refresh training on the policy, which I think is just as important as whatever is stated there is how you use it. So could you talk to us a little bit about how your church keeps this document alive?
Yeah. So first, confession, which, okay, this is recorded and going out into into the internets, but we do not follow it 100% all the time as it is written. And so it still does get lost in the shuffle.
Okay.
And so it has, it works. I believe it works better when it is kind of part of that yearly checklist that we go through with new leaders, or when we're either whether it's the end of the year for the next year or the beginning of the year,
Sure.
as we're
To
taking
ramp up.
all the like training and orientation and leadership equipping and all of those things, of adding that to whatever checklist you kind of already have for that yearly renewal with your leadership team, your board, and just having that kind of as a standing agenda item for your board or leadership and youth program, children's program,
Right.
everything that entails. It is the most helpful thing. It's also helpful, part of the struggle at WestWind is we're a small church and I'm the only full-time staff. And we've gone through obviously youth director and minister transitions and changes. So it's helpful when there's more than one staff member, or even if you don't have a staff member, more than one leader being mindful of it, right? So if it gets forgotten by one person,
Yes.
then somebody else is going to be mindful of it.
Yes.
So having it kind of under the purview of multiple people's responsibilities to be mindful of. So as we're getting a youth person in place, that's going to be one of their responsibilities to be mindful of. It's not all on them, but it's going to be
Right.
helpful to have more than
Right.
one leader, staff person
Right.
responsible for remembering to bring it up and remembering to do trainings and those type of
Yeah.
things.
That seems like an important point you just made about church culture. We're not corporate offices. We don't have HR departments. So I think it probably has to be the responsibility of a felt and shared responsibility among a set of leaders and not just falling to one person.
Right. And become embedded into whatever processes you have, which some churches have more, better than
Of
others
course.
as far as those checklists and those reminders and those systems that it's almost impossible to forget when it's embedded into that, if that makes sense.
What are your elders' responsibilities when it comes to misconduct policy?
So theirs are more, I don't want to say indirect, that's not the right word. Pastoral.
Okay.
I'd say more pastoral. And our elders, just in nature, are more pastoral and more shepherding elders.
Okay.
And I don't know if you'd want to call it ruling elders or so our elders' primary responsibility at all the time is more pastoral, non-anxious presence, and being spiritual leaders in that sense. I don't want to say they're not involved at all. The writing of the policy was mostly leadership team that has elders in it, and then the elders do have a role in responses. If something were to occur, there is the role for an elder there that is more of that pastoral
Part. Okay.
role.
And are they, I'm sorry to cut you off. I didn't mean, do they receive any kind of training to respond?
So ideally, yes.
Okay. Well, yeah, we're talking perfect world.
Yeah, right. Perfect world. So for us, it's still more central around what we call our leadership team, which is our board, and then our youth and children volunteers and leaders. So we don't do specific training with the sexual misconduct with the elders specifically. It's more leadership team, in that regard. So there's overlap there, right?
Right. Some elders are on the leadership team, but it's not every single elder. Okay. I'm tracking. I'm just trying to think of things that could apply to a lot of different churches and how we can keep our policies from going out of sight.
Right. I said I would keep my mouth shut, and I'll intervene just a little bit or give some input. I think the WestWind approach is the right, that you keep it within the leadership team, that this is not an issue where you really want everybody feeling like they're responsible for implementing and asserting the policy, because you're talking about confidential information, you're talking about discipline, and that really does need to be a fairly narrow and smaller circle. And so as disciples, we don't like that. We want to empower everybody. But I think Casey's right. In this situation, you stay fairly specific to your leadership team, and don't try to distribute that much weight around. I mean, everybody's responsible for doing it, but not everybody's responsible for enforcing it.
Right. And I do think what's helpful for all caregivers for that matter, including elders, deacons, board, sponsors, at a minimum, is to have conversations and training around, mandatory reporting and
Yeah, that's what I was getting to. Yeah.
yeah, and how, what are some of the red flags to watch out for and be aware of, and if so, then what are the next steps? Who do you go to? Where do you express those concerns? Having that outlined very specifically and straightforward, where there's no questions about kind of what the next steps are. That does need to be an open conversation with everyone in caregiving professions, not even professions, even leadership and
roles.
service.
Sure. Okay, very good. So where would you suggest a church keeps a policy like this so that it's accessible?
Right.
Or does it need to be? You
Right.
just said very clear steps. If there's an event that needs response, you have a really good clear-cut way to respond. But what if people don't know that?
Right. So obviously, minimum, obviously, in the files on the computer, easy to find, that sort of thing. We do have, if you have bulletin board is old school, but
Yeah.
some have the main area of kind of
A
organizational
shared public
document
space in the church.
to have at least one copy, or if not the copy, to have a statement about it's available by request,
I
type
like
thing.
that.
So, and then we have changed. I don't know the specific one that's shared. May not be the specific one that we currently adopted right now. I think one of the original ones even says like anybody that enters the building gets a copy. And we were like, that's a little excessive. I don't think we need to do that. I think we can just say it's available by request. But ideally, like we do have, new staff sign it and have it on file. Volunteers at those trainings, that's a good time to review it and have those leaders and volunteers sign it. Not have to go through everything in every detail every time, but
Right.
to know that it's here and available. And kind of like when you go to the doctor and you have to sign the HIPAA form every single time. It's not quite that extensive, but that same idea of
It is a good analogy, right? It just refreshes your mind to hear I have rights and they have responsibilities to inform me. And I think it's a great idea to just have a statement that our church has this policy. It is available upon request and who to ask. That right there is a level of transparency that seems pretty easy to put into practice.
Right.
Did you get any questions or pushback that might be useful for it to talk through?
Nothing, like blaring big. More than anything, it was a lot of debate on how detailed does it need to be and how far do we go and what's reasonable for our small church and what's not reasonable, and what can we actually follow through on and what is more appropriate for a big company, and so trying sorting through that, but it wasn't contentious or anything. It was just having that conversation of sorting through the details.
Intentional, not controversial. Okay.
Yeah.
I hear you.
I don't know if that answers
Okay. So that
question.
kind of brings me to this last area of questioning, which is just sort of, you touched upon it. I've forgotten the words you used just now. What can we carry out? What is practical and feasible for a church our size? This is an area where like actions have very real consequences, and the consequences need to be real. They need to have teeth to matter. But how do how does forgiveness and grace factor into a church's policy as distinct from a business's policy?
There's a lot
Or
in that.
maybe so more, and that was a really big question. Another way to kind of tackle it is the idea of reconciliation. Is there a path created for that, understanding we don't force things that shouldn't be forced.
Right. So, I mean, that opens a whole nother can of worms that we could have multiple hour conversations about. And I don't think there's a set answer for that. And that is one of the big conversations that can come from this, particularly if you have a church that has gone through something in the past and has a history of some type of sexual misconduct that has taken place in the congregation. It may not be a staff member, but just
A
some.
congregant, yeah.
I've been
Maybe
part
that
of
congregant's
multiple.
still around.
Yeah, because I've been a part of multiple congregations that has been the case of currently everything's great, but they have history there. And knowing some of that history and how things unfolded from some of those specific instances highlighted the need for that particular question to be discussed of, okay, here's if this something happens, we follow this policy up to this point, but then what? And grace and forgiveness in reconciliation is one of those big conversations that does get controversial and can get very heated and very emotive very quickly.
Because
So you don't prescribe it
oftentimes,
in steps, I'm hearing. And I mean, that seems wise.
oftentimes I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Casey, but that the people who really are pushing for reconciliation or some sort of forgiveness are often the people who were the perpetrators or
Yeah.
the friends of the perpetrators, and that it's hard, right? Because we do think that, I mean, disciples believe, and Christians in general believe, that forgiveness is the way to healing, but also forgiveness, for it to be genuine, has to be done voluntarily. And so learning to be patient with the people who've been hurt, and allowing them to determine when and if that happens
Right.
is, I would think, challenging. So
Right.
I don't know if
And I
that's
do think a lot of that does have to be approached sensitively, but a lot of that is in the I don't use the word victim, but
The
on
wronged parties, yeah,
the
yeah,
wronged parties
yeah.
has a lot more agency or needs to
Okay,
have agency in that
great.
conversation,
Okay,
whether or not necessarily to their perpetrator, like not, I don't mean it like that, but I mean like a lot of that needs to be taken into consideration when those conversations are being had. And for me, I'm always pushed back of, but how do you define forgiveness and how do you
right.
define reconciliation? And because I think that definition is very different for every single one of us. And how that plays out and what that looks like, I think is very different for all of us as well. And for me, forgiveness and reconciliation does not mean putting the wronged party back in potential danger or anyone else for that.
Right. Not
Uh,
the same thing as restored fellowship for someone who's been an abuser. Yeah,
right. And so
not the same.
restoration, reconciliation, forgiveness, that conversation's just around those words. Like even without a specific situation, I think is important for us to expand our view of what that actually means
Okay, I like
for us
that.
individually and for us as a church, instead of some hypothetical theological concept that we like to talk about and feel warm and fuzzy about until it's actually a situation where it needs to be implemented and whatever that implementation looks like. And implementation is not a good word, but
Yeah. I think I understand. Yeah, I think it's all making sense. And what I'm hearing is you do have a stance, and it's power protects the wronged party. So the most protection and the most power lands with the wronged party,
and that's very
as
biblical
things
too,
move
right?
forward.
I mean, if we want to get theological about that, as protecting the oppressed and the voiceless and those that have been wronged. And um, anyways, not to
Yeah.
negate the worth of all, but there's we're called to create that beloved community that has to have
It has to work that way.
rules and guidelines.
That's beautiful. I didn't really know we were going to talk theology in talking about sexual misconduct, but it makes great sense, and it sort of like makes it matter. It makes it matter more, really, and gives every preacher a way.
Uh-oh, she froze.
Yeah, not the time you want your internet to do that to you. But yeah, thank you. And you know, hopefully Ginger will jump back in and things will click back in. But grateful for you, Reverend Tanguay, for the work you've done and the vulnerability with which you've shared that with us. It's just that's really helpful, and would want to underscore uh, power protects the vulnerable. That's the biblical ideal, and so well articulated. So
And
uh,
can I say one more thing that didn't get
yeah,
stated? Just I think it's
sure,
important. This kind of was implied, but the other thing to consider of when you bring these conversations up, obviously they can be triggers for a lot of people. And so even if there's not a history within the congregation that you're aware or unaware of,
right,
just statistics alone will tell us there are people in the room that have been personally affected by sexual misconduct in some way, whether personally or within an immediate family member or friend. And so that's an important awareness going into all of this of conversations of that it can bring up some very sensitive topics and feelings that may not be related to the situation that is at hand right in front of us, that a lot of times there are things in the past that tend to bubble up unintentionally during this time. And so just being sensitive to that, and putting your pastoral readiness in the forefront to be able to respond to that and to be able to approach it sensitively from the beginning of being aware that that's a possibility. Um, and it would be great to even have being proactive again of having a plan in place, if not explicitly with your team, even just mentally yourself as the pastor of, okay, if something comes up, what steps am I going to take? Or even what resources do I have available of if something does come up about somebody's past or present with dealing with sexual misconduct and abuse, and just having that kind of in the ready, just like you're calling me out my nursing that we always say, if you have everything ready, then nothing's going to happen. Everything is going to go smoothly. It's
right,
great.
right,
The one time you don't have all your
right.
emergency stuff ready is the one time something's going to happen. Um, so having
It
that,
only rains. It only rains when I leave my umbrella at home.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. And so, you know, so what are some of those things that you would do to, um, you know, if somebody gets triggered, um, I mean,
I know
we're
I don't like that word.
right, right. I mean, we're recognizing that the words we have used in the past have got some baggage to them and
Right. I
some
apologize for using that word, but
right. But if it, you know, if this touches on a place where somebody is not just scarred but wounded,
mhm.
and they're having to, you know, you have to stop the process, I would imagine, to be church, to be pastoral to that person. Are there things that you would um, say to a pastor? Be prepared for the following. You know, be prepared to do what?
Um, I mean, I think it's helpful to begin conversations, especially when you're getting specific about the sexual misconduct, of forefronting that almost with a pastoral statement of, we're gonna have conversations about this, but you need to be aware of what you need and what you need to stay safe and healthy. And so, if that means that you don't need to take part in this conversation, or, at this point, then you need to feel safe to be able to leave, or to be able to say, I don't think I can have this conversation. Or if you feel fine now, and just always having that statement of permission's not the right word, but hearing that makes a difference, because people don't feel like they can get up and leave or make a statement or not want to talk about it, especially if it's something that they don't want to admit or talk about, or draw attention to themselves if it's a sensitive situation. So bringing that up to begin with. Just pulling out your, all your pastoral training from seminary and everything. But I do think that having that list of resources ready to go is helpful as well. Not to say you're immediately going to pull that out and be like, well, here. Because, the first steps is more that just listening and making that safe space outside of whatever team or, you're working with.
So Casey, I might have missed it when my call dropped out. Do you have a list of resources, a literal physical list that you have compiled?
So I have yes and no. So I have some that like from my personal local list.
That you just know.
It's more of a general, it's not specific to sexual misconduct.
Got it.
Or I mean,
Got it.
But yes, I have a general resource list that I like keep in my office that some is like, benevolence assistance, and then some is like counseling, mental health.
Got it. So the toolkit that pastors carry around in their local,
Right.
if you know your local community, be aware of who could help
Right.
in this situation. Okay.
And if not that, at least knowing, okay, well, who can I call that would
be
know?
more expert. I love how you said it's not permission, it's not exactly acknowledgement, it's maybe it's just kind of normalizing what is the truth, that people are affected. People are definitely affected by sexual misconduct in pretty large numbers, percentage-wise, of the population, and anything that's feels more mentionable can become more manageable, Fred Rogers. So like just normalize taking care of yourself in the midst of working through policies and having conversations. That sounds smart.
Well, thank you both so much. I appreciate you and the insights we brought, and so either of you last words. Casey was addending her last words as we were as you got dropped off of the call, so that was kind of that. But anything else that you both want to make sure we mention as we say goodbye?
No, the only thing I would add is just I'm no expert on this matter by any means. And part of what worked so well for WestWind was the way that we did it as a community and did it as a team. That we did have a team working on it together. We had people coming up from different angles, from the HR angle and the legal angle and the pastoral, so it was helpful in all regards of ministry, that it's not on one person's shoulders to figure it out. And, when we started this conversation, it was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But in fact, you know a lot because you went through the process. So now you know more than you did.
Right. And I will say camping programs usually have good resources too for trainings and that sort of thing. Basic stuff.
Important. Yeah. And I think, I would qualify that, right? You are an expert pastor. You're very, very capable and so, and that was our question, right? I mean, that was I should have been clearer to begin with to say, we are not talking about the legal or even governance end of that. That's not the nature of this conversation. That information is available. You can go get it out there, and should. And I think part of my concern was we've shared the WestWind policy pretty broadly with folk. And my concern has always been that people will copy, cut, and paste that and not do the hard church work of that you all have done to really think through this. And so that's why I thought this conversation was so important, was to hear about, as a pastor, how do you take this journey with a congregation, and just to underscore what you said, that it's you do it as community, you do it as church, and don't delegate that to a single person. And so
yeah, I think it's been really helpful, Casey, and it feels more manageable. It feels more doable, less scary to do this, now in another context. Kind of like if we can listen to you and know that you have done it, we too can do this thing.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Good last words. Thanks.